They laughed at humans until he stood up. The laughter rolled beneath the painted ceiling of Lancaster House like warm champagne, bright and careless and expensive. Men in midnight tuxedos and women glittering with old diamonds turned their heads just enough to see who had become the evening's target, then returned to their smiles with the relaxed cruelty of people who had never once feared the rent, the cold, or the empty cupboard. Alexander Blackwood stood alone near the long Georgian windows overlooking St. James's, one hand resting lightly around a glass of whiskey older than most of the junior ministers in the room. He was exactly the kind of man rich people claimed to admire and privately despised: self-made, controlled, silent, and impossible to place in the neat little boxes London's old families preferred. He wore Seville roe black, but the cut was too clean, too modern for the room. His cufflinks were platinum, his watch discreet and devastatingly expensive, his shoes hand-finished. Nothing on him shouted. Everything on him won. Across the ballroom, Lord Victor Harrington was doing what Victor did best. He was performing ownership. He stood beside the marble fireplace with a ring of bankers, ministers, editors, and hereditary moneyed men who treated him as if breeding were a financial instrument. Victor's silver-streaked hair had been arranged to look accidental. His smile was as polished as the family crest on his signet ring. He had inherited half a county, 3 generations of influence, and the sort of confidence that came from never once hearing the word no from anyone he considered real. He lifted his glass and said, loudly enough for the room to hear, "Britain used to build empires. Now we invite app developers from Whitechapel to advise central bankers." Soft laughter. Not cruel enough to be vulgar. Cruel enough to land. A woman near him murmured, "He's more than an app developer, Victor." Victor smiled wider. "Of course. A myth, then. London so loves a myth. Boy from nowhere becomes billionaire. Teaches the old world how to count." That got another round. Alexander said nothing. He merely turned his head. And in that small motion, Eleanor Price, who had worked beside him for 6 years and feared that stillness in him more than she feared markets, riots, or Downing Street, knew the evening had just become dangerous. She crossed the floor, heels tapping softly over the polished wood, and stopped at his side. Eleanor was 32, sharp-eyed, elegant without excess, wearing navy silk and a face trained into composure by proximity to very powerful men. "Do you want me to handle it?" she asked quietly. Alexander continued to watch Victor. "No." His voice was low, almost absent. Then he drank his whiskey and added, "Let him enjoy being correct for another few minutes." Eleanor's fingers tightened around her tablet. Another few minutes. Not another few hours. Not another few days. Few. She glanced toward the antique clock above the mantel. 9:04 p.m. A small line appeared between her brows. The Global Wealth Council had been Victor's vanity project this year, a private summit disguised as a philanthropic roundtable designed to bring together Britain's most powerful financiers, regulators, data architects, and dynastic money. Officially, they were discussing resilience in the age of autonomous markets. Unofficially, they were deciding who would still matter when the next global shock hit. Victor had expected to preside. Alexander had agreed to attend. That had been mistake number 1. Outside, rain glazed the streets of London. The wet black ribbon of Pall Mall reflected traffic lights and blue police strobes. Farther east, Canary Wharf's towers shone through mist like glass blades. Beneath those towers, unseen by everyone in the ballroom except 2 people, an underground operations floor waited in total silence. At 9:07, all 12 screens behind the stage went black. It happened so quickly that at first the room treated it as a technical embarrassment. A flicker, a hush, a ripple of irritation. Then the private terminals along the walls died. Then the phones. Then the giant market panel displaying live international positions froze on a final cascade of red. At the same moment, somewhere beyond Lancaster House, the first halts began hitting European exchanges. Routing systems failed. Clearing algorithms contradicted themselves. Treasury security protocols sealed the wrong channels and locked out the right people. AI trading custodians, trained for millions of conditions and never once trained for this one, began amplifying a corruption loop buried in a software dependency so old no executive in Britain remembered authorizing it. A junior banker looked down at his phone, frowned, then blanched. "My God!" A minister snapped at an aide. "Get me the treasury." No signal. A hedge fund founder muttered. This isn't local. Victor frowned at the screens as if his disapproval might restart them. Who is responsible for this? He demanded. No one answered. Then the floor moved under the room in a way that had nothing to do with architecture. Not a physical tremor. A social one. People began understanding that the numbers they lived inside had gone dark. The room split instantly into types. The old families demanded answers. The bankers demanded access. The politicians demanded control. The younger founders demanded bandwidth. Alexander Blackwood set his empty glass down on a silver tray and straightened. That movement, more than the outage, pulled certain eyes toward him. He did not look surprised. Victor noticed it too. Their gazes met across the room. Victor's expression hardened. Alexander inclined his head the slightest fraction, as if acknowledging a host just before leaving a dull dinner. Micro twist. He had been waiting for this. Eleanor leaned closer. How bad? Alexander checked the slim black watch on his wrist. Worse than the model. Better than the alternatives. People are going to hear that one day and hate you for it. One day, he said. She almost smiled. Then her tablet vibrated with a local offline signal. Not a public network. One of theirs. She opened the secure line. A single message appeared. Phase 1 confirmed. Eleanor looked up sharply. So it's live. Alexander nodded once. Behind them, panic crossed the ballroom like flame taking old paper. Men who controlled pension funds, shipping routes, national newspapers, and ruling party donations were suddenly shouting over each other like stranded commuters. One woman in emerald silk dropped a crystal flute so hard it shattered. An MP was trying and failing to look calm while quietly calculating whether he could get to a military contact before the scandal touched him. Victor was already coming toward Alexander, not walking so much as cutting through people, his public smile gone, his aristocratic ease peeled back to reveal something meaner and simpler beneath. Blackwood. Alexander turned fully to face him. Victor stopped a yard away. Up close, he smelled faintly of bergamot and fury. What do you know? Victor said. Alexander considered the question. Enough. Victor's jaw tightened. Then fix it. A few heads turned. The surrounding conversations thinned. Alexander's tone did not change. Why would I? Victor stared at him as if the answer were obvious to anyone with blood. Because if the system goes down, everyone in this room loses. Alexander looked past him, at the bankers pale beneath chandelier light, the ministers clutching dead phones, the heirs meeting, perhaps for the first time, the possibility that inheritance did not count as skill. Then he looked back at Victor. No, he said. Everyone in this room learns. Victor gave a short, disbelieving laugh. Don't be theatrical. I'm not. He stepped around Victor. The older man caught his sleeve. It was a tiny breach of decorum. In that room, among those people, it was nearly intimate. Alexander's eyes dropped to Victor's hand. Victor let go immediately. Micro twist. For the first time in years, Victor Harrington felt like the poorer man. Whatever game this is, Victor said, you're not big enough to play it alone. Alexander's face did not change, but something colder entered the air around him. I didn't build alone, he said. I built what survives when everyone else assumes the music will keep playing. He turned to Eleanor. Bring the car. Eleanor was already moving. The Home Secretary appeared from nowhere, flanked by security and urgency. Mr. Blackwood, I need a word. Alexander paused. Sir Malcolm Reed was 60, broad-faced, immaculate, and increasingly aware that government authority depended on systems now making strange noises in the dark. He held himself with official gravity, but there was sweat at his temple. This event is under temporary restrictions, Reed said. No one leaves until we understand what we're dealing with. Alexander regarded him with polite interest. Then I suggest you understand it quickly. Reed took a breath. Is this cyber terror? No. State attack? No. Then what? Alexander's answer came with the weight of something he had known for years. Civilization, he said, discovering it outsourced too much of itself. And with that he walked out, leaving the richest room in Britain staring after the only man who did not look frightened. Outside, the rain had sharpened. Cold drops struck the stone steps, and the waiting black Rolls-Royce like thrown beads. London smelled of wet pavement, exhaust, and the electric edge of oncoming trouble. Eleanor opened the rear door. Alexander got in. She followed. The car pulled away from Lancaster House, just as the first emergency bulletin reached analog radio. Trading suspended across multiple European platforms. Payment verification instability spreading. Temporary precautionary closures under review. Temporary. Alexander looked out at the city sliding past the window. Clubs with velvet ropes, embassy lights, hotel awnings, cab headlights smeared across the wet. Far east lay the towers where the people who mocked him borrowed his ideas and pretended not to notice. Eleanor broke the silence first. You still haven't told me whether you're saving it or replacing it. He watched a cyclist fight through the rain in a cheap plastic poncho, head down, determined. Both, he said. That answer took her back 6 years, to the first week she'd worked for him, when she found him in a Whitechapel warehouse, teaching a room full of couriers and warehouse clerks how to use offline credit ledgers in case of network failure. She had asked him why a man with investors from Singapore and New York was wasting time on delivery riders from East London. He had said, because they notice collapse first. At the time, she thought it was some darkly poetic line about supply chains. Later, she learned it was biography. Alexander Blackwood had grown up on the wrong side of every British photograph sold to tourists. Not postcard London, not Royal London, not Heritage London. He had grown up in damp council flats where mold climbed corners and electric meters decided whether a family would have heat. His mother cleaned offices in the city at night, emptying bins beside desks worth more than her yearly wages. His father, briefly present and permanently disappointed, drank himself into violence and then into disappearance. By 12, Alexander understood 3 things. Rich people called stability natural. Poor people knew it was rented. And systems always broke first on the people least protected from the weather. At 14, he sold patch phones in school corridors. At 16, he was building simple arbitrage tools for corner shop owners using secondhand hardware and pirated manuals. At 19, he was sleeping 4 hours a night and teaching himself quantitative modeling in the public library because university wanted proof of means and he had proof only of mind. At 22, he made his first real money-building predictive logistics software during a port strike. At 26, he sold a payments optimization platform nobody important understood until it saved them 8 figures. At 32, he became unavoidable. At 38, he stopped trusting any system he hadn't personally imagined failing. The Rolls-Royce turned east. London changed window by window. Mayfair's old stone gave way to harder lines. The roads widened. Towers rose. Billboards glowed. Delivery scooters hissed through rain. A siren flared and vanished. Screens in office lobbies were black. People were gathering under awnings, staring into useless phones. Public reaction? Alexander asked. Eleanor checked the offline uplink. Confusion first. Then queues. ATMs starting to fail. Contactless dead in most central zones. There's a rumor that several supermarkets have paused digital checkouts. Cash. Already thinning. He nodded. Send release 1. Eleanor hesitated. All boroughs. All boroughs that matter in the first 12 hours. She keyed the command. Micro twist. While Westminster panicked, Alexander was quietly turning on a second economy. The car descended into a private access ramp beneath one of the anonymous towers at Canary Wharf. Security shutters opened before them. The Rolls glided into a concrete chamber lit by clean white strips. Beyond a steel door, down a narrow corridor no guest would ever see, lay the operations floor. It looked nothing like the trading rooms Victor adored. No theater, no glass walls, no rows of showy terminals. Just a broad underground hall, matte black screens, silent fiber racks, and 50 people already at work as if they had expected this night since childhood. Some had suits on. Some had hoodies. Some had steel-toed boots and courier helmets clipped to bags. One older woman wore supermarket shoes and moved through encryption dashboards with frightening speed. A former Army signals officer was briefing 2 teenagers from Hackney who had once run illicit mesh networks during rolling outages. A Welsh engineer was calibrating local verification nodes with a dentist's precision. This was not London's elite. This was London's memory of surviving itself. When Alexander entered, the room rose only halfway. No applause. No theatrics. Just attention. He preferred it that way. Status, he said. A red-haired systems lead named Imogen answered first. Primary fallback mesh active in London, Birmingham, Manchester, Bristol, Liverpool, Glasgow, Cardiff, Belfast. Rural patch links slower, but stable. Community nodes have begun local authorization. Fraud rates near zero because nobody understands the system yet. A stocky man with scarred knuckles added. Supply credits rolling through food and medicine corridors. Fuel restricted. We can prioritize emergency services if Whitehall stops pretending pride is infrastructure. Another voice from the back. Markets are still in freefall on the old rails. International contagion spreading. Frankfurt and Paris are trying to isolate. Too late. Alexander took that in without visible emotion. Open hospital and transport priority bans. Freeze luxury imports. Release neighborhood stabilizers where ATM failures exceed 40%. Imogen nodded and turned away, already issuing commands. Eleanor watched him as the room responded with immediate competence. This was the version of Alexander nobody in Lancaster House believed in. Not the billionaire host photographed beside heads of state. Not the algorithmic predator journals loved to fear, but the boy from East London who had spent his life expecting winter and quietly building roofs. Sir Malcolm will call, Eleanor said. He won't get through this layer. He'll come in person then. Good. He'll learn faster. She glanced around the room. You really think this can hold? He looked at the people he trusted most, the ones with no interest in appearing important. It doesn't need to hold forever, he said. Only longer than the old world's illusion. On the far wall, a city map bloomed with lights. Not wealth. Function. Clusters of green spread from borough to borough as local nodes came online. Small shops, pharmacies, bus depots, community kitchens, independent garages, clinics, warehouses, corners of the country invisible to men like Victor until they stopped working. Alexander watched the map and thought, not for the first time, that rich people misunderstood systems because systems had been kind to them. Poor people understood every seam. They had to. His private line pulsed. Victor. Alexander almost ignored it. Almost. Then he answered on audio only. Victor's voice came sharp, clipped, and thinner than usual. Where are you? Busy. You can't just vanish in the middle of this. Watch me. A breath, controlled with effort. I know you're involved. In what? In surviving, apparently, Victor snapped. The government is already talking emergency powers. If you've hidden assets, if you've set up parallel flows, I can make sure. Alexander cut in. You can make sure what? That the right school tie gets first access. Silence. Then Victor tried another angle. Softer. More dangerous. We don't need to be enemies tonight. Alexander stared at the glowing map of London's poor districts coming back to life before its rich districts even understood the rules had changed. We were never enemies, Victor, he said. You were a weather pattern. He ended the call. Current part words, 2163. Total words, 2163. Part 2. By midnight, the old economy had stopped pretending it was merely inconvenienced. The queues formed first in Westminster and Kensington, where embarrassment lasted all of 6 minutes before fear overtook it. People in cashmere and tailored overcoats stood under shop awnings jabbing dead cards at dead terminals, insisting the machine had made a mistake. In Brixton, Leicester, Newcastle, and parts of East London, the reaction was different. Less outrage. More calculation. People checked what they had, who they knew, what they could carry, and what still worked. Alexander had predicted that too. At 12:14 a.m., Sir Malcolm Reed arrived underground with 2 security officers, a Treasury advisor, and the brittle expression of a man who had spent the last 3 hours discovering how much of British authority was powered by companies it did not own and software it did not understand. He was shown past steel doors, silent checkpoints, and a corridor lined with emergency battery walls before entering the operations floor. He stopped just inside, taking in the map, the moving bands of local trade, the people working without panic. What is this? Reed asked. Continuity, Alexander said. Reed turned. You built an unsanctioned financial network. I built a functioning one. The Treasury advisor, a narrow man named Lyle with exhausted eyes, stepped forward. This is illegal. Imogen, without looking up from her console, said, so is starvation by API failure. Pick your concern. Reed raised a hand to quiet him before Alexander could decide whether to. Mr. Blackwood, the Bank of England is attempting restoration. If you're siphoning activity into a shadow system, you may be worsening the crisis. Alexander walked toward the central display. No, I'm revealing it. He touched the screen. A series of overlays appeared. First, the public rails, flashing crimson as transactional failure spread. Second, food distribution dependence. Third, hospital procurement chains. Fourth, local payment confidence by district. Then a final layer. Communities with high cash fragility and low institutional buffering. These people go first, Alexander said. Reed frowned. You mean the vulnerable? No. I mean the people your system reaches last and blames first. The room quieted. Alexander turned back to him. Every major optimization in the last decade made the same moral assumption. Resilience at the top will somehow trickle down as resilience below. It doesn't. It concentrates fragility. You built a country where one corrupted layer in a payment architecture can stop a pensioner from buying bread in Hull. Lal said, "That's absurd." "No," Eleanor said evenly. That was Thursday. Reed looked from one face to another. There was no hysteria here, only competence and a disconcerting lack of respect for official delay. "What do you want?" he asked finally. "Temporary legal cover for local authorization nodes. Transport coordination. Priority fuel for food, medicine, and emergency service routes. Public acknowledgement that continuity alternatives are legitimate until core restoration is proved, not promised. You want the government to endorse you. I want the government to choose whether it prefers survival or ego." Reed's mouth tightened. "You don't speak to ministers that way." Alexander's expression did not shift. "Tonight I do." Micro twist. The state had come underground not to arrest him, but to ask how to keep the lights on. For one long moment Reed stood very still. Then he did something unexpected. He laughed. Not because anything was funny. Because the absurdity had finally breached his official shell. "I spent 23 years climbing through party structures," he said, half to himself. Cabinet committees. National resilience briefings. Every room full of people calling each other indispensable. He looked up at the map again. And the only comm system in the city is under a financial tower, run by couriers and women in supermarket shoes. The older woman in question didn't look away from her terminal. "Marks and Spencer, if that matters." Reed rubbed a hand down his face. "Send me the legal framework you need." Lal stared at him. "Sir Malcolm." "I heard him." Reed looked at Alexander. "But if this turns into a power grab, I will bury you." Alexander gave the faintest smile. "Then I suggest you keep it from needing one." While Whitehall made its reluctant bargains, Victor Harrington was discovering how much of his life had been arranged by invisible servants. At 1 in the morning, he was in his Belgravia townhouse, wearing the same black tie from Lancaster House and shouting at a private banker over a satellite line that kept cutting out. The study around him smelled of leather, cedar, and ancient entitlement. Portraits of dead Harrington men stared down from dark walls as if personally offended by digital insolvency. Victor had liquid wealth in 12 jurisdictions, secured lines, art, land, rare wine, private memberships, and enough political leverage to tilt small legislation. Yet none of it could authorize a lorry, reopen a locked payment rail, or get his chef's groceries by dawn. His staff had become cautious around him in a way he had not seen since childhood, when his father's tempers made silverware tremble. "Sir," said Meredith, his long-serving house manager from the doorway, "the suppliers are refusing deferred settlement without local verification." "What does that even mean?" "It means they want proof of value now." "I am the proof of value." She did not answer. That silence cut deeper than any insult at Lancaster House. Victor ended the dead banker call and poured himself whiskey with a hand he hoped was steady. From the window, he could see the wet amber of Belgravia lamplight and, farther off, a city that seemed to be holding its breath. He thought of Alexander leaving the ballroom like a man departing a theater before the final act because he already knew the ending. Victor had hated him on sight years ago. Not for the money. Victor understood money. Not for the intellect. Victor collected brilliant people like cufflinks. He hated Alexander because the man carried no reverence. Old buildings did not impress him. Accents did not disarm him. Titles slid off him as if they had been priced and found decorative. Worse, Alexander remembered things rich people preferred to call unfortunate rather than structural. Victor picked up the satellite phone again and dialed a different number. He had resources too. In Shoreditch, in a converted warehouse rebranded as a private innovation lab, a man named Daniel Vale answered on the fourth ring. Vale had once founded 3 cybersecurity companies, sold 2, buried 1, and developed a taste for expensive trainers and morally flexible contracts. He owed Victor money, favor, and possibly freedom. "I need Blackwood mapped," Victor said without preamble. "Assets, fallback infrastructure, hidden personnel, everything." Vale exhaled slowly. "Tonight, especially tonight. That won't be simple. Nothing worth paying for is." Vale named a number. Victor agreed before he'd finished it. Micro twist. Victor's first move in a world without trust was to hire a man no one trusted. By dawn, Britain had split into 2 versions of itself. The first was televised. Ministers in controlled tones. Financial experts using phrases like temporary dislocation and cross-system verification. Anchors trying to remain reassuring while standing in front of footage of queues, shuttered till points, and increasingly irritable shoppers. The second version was lived. Corner stores in Tottenham accepting mesh credits. Bus depots in Manchester receiving priority fuel authorizations from Alexander's network before central systems could locate their own forms. A fishmonger in Hull trading verified stock against local food tokens. A pharmacist in Cardiff crying with relief because her medicine's order had cleared through a route the official portal still insisted did not exist. At 7:30 a.m., Alexander left the operations floor for the first time since the collapse and drove, not to Westminster, but to Whitechapel. Rain had thinned to mist. Market stalls were half open. Delivery vans idled at curbs. The air smelled of frying oil, wet brick, and early bread. He stood outside the tower block where he had lived until 17 and looked up at windows he could still map from memory. 3rd floor, left side, where the heating failed every winter. 4th floor, the flat where Mrs. Ramon had fed half the corridor when benefits came late. Ground level, the stairwell where boys learned hardness before they learned algebra. He had bought the building anonymously 3 years ago and funded repairs through a trust that never mentioned his name. Pride was simpler when invisible. A boy in a school blazer stopped near him, staring at the black car and then at Alexander's coat. "You famous?" the boy asked. Alexander looked at him. Not usefully. The boy frowned as if filing that answer for later. Mrs. Ramon herself emerged from the main door carrying 2 grocery bags and peered at Alexander for one long second before recognition broke over her face. Ollie. Only 4 people in the world still called him that. He took the bags from her automatically. "You shouldn't be carrying these. And you shouldn't be looking like a funeral director who won the lottery," she said, then studied him more closely. "You haven't slept. There's a lot on. There's always a lot on." She nodded toward the shops at the end of the street where handwritten signs now read local credit accepted. "People say some clever fool made a system before the old one broke." He carried the bags into the lobby. "People say many things." Mrs. Ramon snorted. "And when they start saying your name, then it's already too late." Upstairs, while she put away groceries and scolded him for being too thin in the same breath, he listened to neighborhood updates coming through Eleanor's earpiece. Supply confidence holding. Opportunistic theft limited. Local repair circles activating. Schools considering temporary meal guarantees through neighborhood bans. This, more than markets, told him whether the country would hold. Not indices. Breakfast. He was about to leave when Mrs. Ramon caught his wrist. Her hands were small, lined, strong. "You've got your mother's eyes when you're tired," she said. Alexander looked away toward the window. "She would have liked that people need you." "No," he said after a moment. "She would have hated the reason." On the drive back, Eleanor studied him in the rearview mirror. "You only visit when you're afraid," she said. He did not ask how she knew. "Am I?" "Yes." He watched the city pass, police directing traffic at dead junctions, independent cafes suddenly busy because they could still trade, office workers in expensive coats learning the humiliating mathematics of helplessness. "I'm afraid," he said, "of winning the wrong thing." That shut her up for several streets. Then her secure line pinged. She checked it and went still. "We have a breach attempt." "External." She swallowed. "Internal architecture mapping. Sophisticated. Someone's hunting the fallback network." Alexander's expression sharpened. "Source." "Not yet." He already knew. "Find it. Back underground." Imogen ran trace trees across mirrored nodes. Daniel Vale was good, but like many very clever men, he had confused invisibility with uniqueness. His signature hid in timing habits, handshake preferences, and a particular affection for recursive noise shaping that made junior analysts feel inadequate and senior analysts feel insulted. Imogen smiled without humor. Found him. Alexander looked at the screen. Open a channel. Vale answered audio only, voice smooth and annoyingly amused. I wondered how long. How much did Victor pay you? Alexander asked. Enough to insult my better judgment. Leave. Vale chuckled. You think this is personal? Everyone in London is trying to find the hidden rails. If I step back, someone louder steps in. Then hear this carefully, Alexander said. The next layer beneath what you've seen supports hospitals and food chains. You keep poking it for aristocratic curiosity, and you don't become a hacker. You become a man who made insulin late. The silence on the line changed. Not fear. Recognition. Vale said, more quietly. You really built it for that. Yes. Another pause. Then, Victor thinks you're trying to crown yourself. Alexander's gaze rested on London's glowing map. Victor thinks in furniture. Inherited rooms. Named chairs. I think in thresholds. Whether children eat before systems recover. Vale breathed out. He won't stop. Neither will I. Vale disconnected. Micro twist. Alexander had just gained an enemy's respect and lost his contractor. An hour later, Victor learned that Vale had returned his payment and deleted the operation. He stood in his study, face rigid, while Meredith announced that 2 more of his logistics partners had switched to local settlement routes associated, indirectly and infuriatingly, with Blackwood's network. Victor looked at the dark portrait of his grandfather, who had broken strikes with police dinners and newspaper campaigns, and understood that he was facing something old money had no instinct for. Not rebellion. Redundancy. He whispered to the empty room. What are you doing, Blackwood? The answer arrived from every borough his name was not officially in. Surviving. Current part words, 2008. Total words, 4171. Part 3. On the 3rd day, the newspapers found a story simple enough for the public to hold. The Financial Herald called Alexander Blackwood Britain's shadow chancellor of necessity. A tabloid asked, who elected the man who saved your card machine? One broadsheet, trying and failing to sound neutral, described him as an opportunistic infrastructure oligarch operating in the moral vacuum between government paralysis and market collapse. Alexander read none of them. Eleanor did and summarized with deadpan efficiency. They're afraid you're too competent to be decent. They've mistaken that before, he said. She looked up from the clippings. Have they? He didn't answer. The underground floor had shifted from emergency mode to controlled expansion. Britain had not stabilized, not remotely, but the first panic wave had broken against routines. Alexander's network had revived. Local credit pools, fuel tree-off, food logistics, medicine bans, repair authorizations. Independent councils and cautious police chiefs had quietly begun using the system under other names, so no one in Whitehall had to publicly admit a billionaire from East London had beaten the state to continuity. That hypocrisy did not particularly bother Alexander. What bothered him was tempo. The old rails were still not dead enough to stop interfering and not alive enough to trust. That in-between condition bred political vanity. Men who failed loudly on Monday wanted photo opportunities on Thursday. Regulators who had mocked distributed continuity for years were drafting oversight language before they understood the basics. Several major banks were already planning to return with a cleaner logo and the same assumptions. The room's central screen shifted to a new alert. Birmingham. A warehouse cluster had halted because an old system insurance lockout was contesting local verification. Result: delayed food movement. Alexander stood instantly. Patch over it. Imogen frowned. We can, but if we override too aggressively, we expose the node structure. Then reroute authority through civic service layers. Let the trucks think the permission came from somewhere respectable. That, Imogen said, fingers moving, is the most British sentence I've heard all week. Micro twist. Alexander wasn't just building a better system. He was teaching it how to wear a tie. At noon, he was summoned to Westminster. Not invited. Summoned. The distinction amused him enough to accept. The cabinet office briefing room smelled faintly of stale coffee, wet wool, and institutional denial. The walls were too beige to inspire honesty. Around the central table sat the Prime Minister, Sir Malcolm Reed, bank advisors, 2 military logistics figures, and 3 men from finance who already looked like survivors of an extinct religion. Victor Harrington was there as well. That was revealing. Victor did not officially belong in the room, which meant he had insisted, leveraged, or frightened his way into it. He sat immaculate again, though the strain beneath his eyes remained. His tie was darker than usual. Mourning attire, Alexander thought, for the death of unquestioned relevance. The Prime Minister, Julia Barron, gestured to the empty chair opposite. Mr. Blackwood. She was brisk, sharp, and too intelligent to waste time pretending the last 72 hours hadn't reordered several invisible hierarchies. Alexander sat. Barron folded her hands. Let's skip the theater. Your network is functioning. Ours is partially functioning. Markets abroad are pressuring us for clarity. Parliament wants accountability. The public wants bread. I want to know whether you're a bridge, a problem, or a replacement. Alexander considered her. Depends what you intend to preserve. One of the finance men bristled. This is precisely the issue. The man speaks as if the nation were a prototype. Alexander looked at him. And you built it as if failure were theoretical. Barron cut across before the room split into performance. Can your system scale nationally for 90 days? Yes. Can it integrate with restored legacy rails if and when they're clean? Yes. Can it be nationalized? No. The answer hit the table like dropped glass. Victor almost smiled. At last, something he thought he understood. Barron's face did not move. Explain. Because nationalization of this architecture would kill the one quality that made it resilient. It was built by people who expect institutions to arrive late. You centralize it too early. You make it behave like the thing that broke. A military logistician, a woman with cropped gray hair named Brigadier Shaw, leaned forward. Distributed command with constrained interoperability. Alexander glanced at her. Exactly. The bristling financier threw up a hand. That's governance by patchwork. No, Shaw said before Alexander could. That's field survivability. Victor finally entered. Or private sovereignty. Let's not dress ambition as charity. Alexander turned to him. Victor held his gaze coolly. You've always wanted this. A country dependent on you. Neighborhoods trading on your rails. Ministries negotiating on your terms. It's elegant, I admit. Collapse arrives, and the man everyone laughed at becomes indispensable. The room watched Alexander carefully. He could have denied it. Instead, he asked, do you know the difference between control and dependency, Victor? Victor said nothing. Dependency is when the people at the bottom have no alternative when you fail them. Control is what men like you imagine you own because the silver was inherited. He leaned back. I don't want a dependent country. I want a country that does not break because one elegant room in London has a bad week. Reed exhaled slowly. Barron watched them both, seeing more than either liked. Micro twist. This was no longer a crisis meeting. It was a referendum on what power meant. The PM made her choice with characteristic bluntness. We'll establish a temporary continuity charter, she said. Your network remains operational under emergency law, audited by a mixed board, locally administered where already embedded, nationally coordinated where necessary. In return, full transparency on critical flows, no speculative profiteering, and no asset capture during emergency conditions. Victor turned sharply. You're legitimizing a parallel state. Barron replied without looking at him. I'm legitimizing food deliveries. The meeting ended there in substance, if not in paperwork. As aides gathered folders and Reed began issuing follow-ups, Victor intercepted Alexander in the corridor outside. The corridor was lined with framed photographs of governments smiling through previous disasters. The carpet absorbed sound. It was the kind of place where Britain liked to imagine itself calm. Victor stopped in front of him. You could have taken the banks, Victor said quietly. You still can. Half of them are on their knees. Alexander adjusted his cuff very slightly. Is that what you would do? Victor's mouth tightened. Of course it is. That's what power is for. No, Alexander said. That's what your kind mistakes it for. Victor's eyes darkened. My kind? Yes. Men born inside walls they did not build. Men who think owning the house means understanding the foundations. Victor gave a low, humorless laugh. And you think sleeping on concrete gave you wisdom? Alexander stepped closer. He was not taller than Victor, but in that narrow corridor he felt immovably present. No, he said. It gave me an education you people outsource. Victor's face flushed. Don't moralize at me. You wear better suits than I do. You travel by armored car. You drink whiskey that could pay a family's heating bill for a winter. Yes. The honesty of it wrong-footed Victor. Alexander continued, voice flat. I became rich because I was tired of being vulnerable to men who liked speeches about character. Wealth is insulation. I bought it on purpose. The difference between us is that I know what it's for. Victor opened his mouth, then closed it. For one split second, there was something almost naked in his expression. Not just anger. Wound. Then it was gone. Micro twist. Victor did not hate Alexander for escaping poverty. He hated him for doing it without seeking permission from class. That evening, on the drive back east, Eleanor broke a silence that had lasted from Westminster to Tower Bridge. He got to you. Alexander looked out at the Thames, a dark moving blade under the bridge lights. No. Yes. He said nothing. You hate when he's right about anything, she said. And he was right about one thing. You do use wealth as armor. After a while, Alexander said, you don't. Eleanor let out a short breath. I use competence. It's cheaper. That almost drew a smile. Back underground, another problem waited. Imogen met him at the lift. We've got coordinated pressure from 3 major banking consortia, 2 insurance clusters, and a law firm old enough to believe powdered wigs should come back. They're trying to force a judicial freeze on local nodes. Grounds: unlicensed issuance, market distortion, emergency overreach. Pick a phrase. Public posture? They're calling for order. Alexander took the tablet from her and scanned the filings. There it was beneath the legal language. Panic that the public might discover daily life could be stabilized without asking permission from institutions that had failed them. He handed the tablet back. Prepare the data release. Eleanor looked up sharply. All of it? Yes. That will humiliate half the city. Good. It'll also reveal how dependent those same institutions became on our silent support in the last 3 days. Better. By 9 that night, the country had a new spectacle. A public report, dryly titled Continuity Support Interactions, appeared on every functioning news desk. It showed, line by line, which banks had used Blackwood's emergency mesh to keep cash transport moving while privately denouncing it, which insurers had quietly requested node verification to protect warehouses while publicly demanding legal restraint, which elite districts had benefited from rerouted food chains supported by the same unlicensed architecture they now called dangerous. Britain, when shown hypocrisy with numbers attached, enjoyed itself immensely. The backlash was immediate. So was the support. Corner shops printed Blackwood rails kept U.S. open signs in windows. Hospital procurement heads publicly thanked unnamed fallback engineers. Mayors who had spent years smiling beside failed smart city pilots now praised community resilience with suspicious enthusiasm. And Victor Harrington watched public sentiment begin to tilt away from pedigree and toward practical usefulness. For the first time since the collapse, he felt not merely threatened, but obsolete. That sensation was intolerable. So he did what desperate men of rank often do when history stops flattering them. He chose escalation. Current part words, 1948. Total words, 6119. Part 4. Victor escalated beautifully. He did not send thugs to a warehouse or have some idiot smash servers with a crowbar. That would have been vulgar, traceable, and beneath the standards he still imagined himself keeping. Instead, he attacked reputation, legality, and trust, the elegant weapons of a man bred to wound with committees. By the 4th morning, 3 newspapers were running variations of the same whisper. Blackwood profits, AS Britain panics. An anonymous brief circulated among MPs suggesting Alexander's emergency network had been seeded in advance of collapse for personal leverage. Old photographs resurfaced of his earliest ventures in East London, carefully captioned to imply criminal adjacency rather than neighborhood reality. A former employee appeared on television claiming Blackwood systems had contingency structures too prepared to be innocent. None of it was entirely invented. That was why it was dangerous. Eleanor watched the coverage on a silent wall of screens and said, "He's not trying to prove you caused it. He's trying to make enough smoke that people stop caring whether you did." Alexander, halfway through a briefing on medicine corridors in Yorkshire, did not look up. Standard technique when substance fails. "Are you angry?" "No." She tilted her head. "Liar." He finally looked at the screen showing his younger face outside a warehouse in Whitechapel, all sharp bones and borrowed coat and refusal. "I'm offended by poor craftsmanship." But anger was there. Not because Victor had come for him. Because Victor had come for the wrong years. Those years belonged to cold stairwells, library light, cheap electronics, and the small humiliations of poor brilliance in a country that adored genius mostly after it had become profitable. Alexander could survive attack. He disliked theft. Imogen interrupted. We've got a larger problem. Node confidence in affluent districts is wobbling because several legal firms are advising clients to reject mesh settlement as potentially reversible under future authority review. Translation: the rich are trying to wait out reality. Can they? Eleanor asked. Alexander thought of pantries, generators, domestic staff, private schools, old cash, private roads to private airfields. For a week, he said. Maybe two. Then the parts of life they never learned to notice start failing. As if summoned by prophecy, another alert flashed. A refrigerated logistics chain serving premium food imports had collapsed. Not critical nationally, symbolic locally. Belgravia restaurants were suddenly improvising menus. Chelsea grocers were running low on vanity. Imogen looked delighted. Civilization is ending one truffle at a time. Alexander said, don't enjoy it too much. I'm enjoying it the exact right amount. Micro twist. The first real pain in London's richest streets did not come from hunger. It came from inconvenience. At noon, Alexander did something Victor would never have predicted. He called a press conference in Whitechapel. Not the city. Not Westminster. Whitechapel. The room was a renovated community hall attached to a public library, its brick exterior still carrying the weather of a century. The wooden floor creaked. The overhead lights buzzed faintly. Behind the podium were no flags, no ministerial seals, no sponsor logos. Just a plain wall and rows of mismatched chairs now filled with journalists, local shop owners, logistics managers, nurses, 2 union representatives, a school cook from Tower Hamlets, and one very puzzled foreign correspondent who had clearly been expecting a hedge fund bunker. Alexander walked in wearing charcoal, no tie, and the same unreadable expression he wore when buying companies or attending funerals. The room quieted. He did not begin with greetings. He began with a spreadsheet. Projected behind him, district by district continuity data, food flows, medicine access, transport stabilization, node activation, neighborhood confidence indexes. He spoke for 12 minutes with surgical clarity, explaining exactly what the fallback rails did, exactly where they had helped, and exactly how many official systems had already leaned on them while publicly pretending otherwise. Then he said, there is a story being told that this infrastructure exists to enrich me. That story is useful to people who prefer fragility if they're seated comfortably above it. So let me be plain. He paused. The room leaned in. I became rich because poor people are always the first ones asked to be patient during failure. I was done being patient. No flourish. No raised voice. Yet the sentence struck harder than any slogan Victor's media people had prepared. Alexander continued. This network is not charity. It is not benevolence. It is memory designed into infrastructure. It remembers that systems do not break equally. It remembers who gets told to queue. It remembers which boroughs lose heat first, which children lose meals first, which prescriptions become optional to people who still need them. If that embarrasses certain institutions, their options are simple. Function better, or be replaced where they fail. One reporter from a national broadcaster raised a hand. Mr. Blackwood, did you know a collapse of this scale was coming? I knew one was possible. That sounds evasive. It sounds mathematically literate. A murmur of laughter. Another journalist asked, are you trying to build a private state? Alexander looked at the school cook in the second row, then back at the reporter. No, I'm trying to build a country where school kitchens don't need divine intervention because a software stack had a nervous breakdown. The room broke into a rough, startled applause it hadn't meant to give. Micro twist. For the first time, Alexander stopped speaking to elites and started speaking over them. Victor watched the broadcast from Belgravia with a stillness that frightened even him. He had underestimated a critical variable. Alexander was not merely competent. He was legible. The public could understand him. Worse, they could project themselves into him. He had the polish of wealth without the softness of inherited insulation. He could stand in Whitechapel in a coat worth several mortgage payments and still sound like a man who remembered what mold smelled like in winter. That combination was politically lethal. Victor turned off the television and called Reed. Sir Malcolm answered, sounding like a man sleeping in 40-minute fragments. What? Victor kept his tone measured. You're losing control of the narrative. We lost control of the narrative when the Tills died. Don't be flippant. Blackwood is converting emergency legitimacy into public mandate. He's converting food into food. Victor, you know exactly what I mean. A pause. Then Reed said, yes, I do. And if you're calling to suggest we cripple the one thing holding local order together, I advise against it. Victor's fingers tightened around the phone. You sound impressed. I sound tired. There's a difference. When the line went dead, Victor stood alone in his perfect study and realized he had lost the most valuable commodity in British power politics: confidence from frightened officials. Not all of it. Enough. So he reached for what remained. Money, land, private channels, old loyalties. That evening, in a private room above a members' club in Mayfair, Victor met 6 men and 1 woman who between them controlled shipping, refrigerated storage, private security, agricultural aggregation, legal delay, and 1 newspaper group that could make a bishop look corrupt by breakfast. They drank old whiskey and discussed the country as if it were a listed company in temporary distress. Victor did not ask for chaos. He asked for pressure. Withhold selectively, he said. Nothing theatrical. Just enough to demonstrate the limits of Blackwood's little miracle. Delay if node verification touches your assets. Challenge jurisdiction. Demand guarantees. Force him to overextend. The woman, Eleanor Fenwick of Fenwick Storage Group, watched him coolly over her glass. And if local authorities seize under emergency doctrine? They won't, Victor said. Confident. They still think in terms of legality. She smiled faintly. That's a very old rich sentence, Victor. One shipping magnate grunted. What do we get? Victor replied. When this recenters, we decide the recentering. That was enough for most of them. Not because they trusted him. Because class, when threatened, often mistakes coordination for destiny. The first effects showed up in the Northeast. A series of refrigerated depots flagged compliance reviews and paused release. Not medicine. Food. Enough to rattle local confidence. Social media flooded with videos of lorries waiting behind locked gates while managers cited legal uncertainty. By morning, 2 tabloids were running captions about Blackwood bottlenecks. Imogen tracked the pattern in under an hour. This isn't market noise, she said. It's choreography. Alexander studied the ownership trees and smiled without warmth. Victor found his cousins. Can we force release? Eleanor asked. Not cleanly. We'd trigger a court showdown they've prepared for. Then what? Alexander turned away from the screen and looked at the room. Couriers, coders, logisticians, neighborhood coordinators. People who had no clubs in Mayfair, no vineyards in France, no titled grandparents. Then he said, we stop asking permission from men who store strawberries like they're constitutional assets. The plan that followed was so aggressively practical that it felt almost vulgar. Blackwood's teams mapped every independent cold storage unit, brewery cellar, community kitchen freezer, fisheries depot, supermarket backroom, and university catering facility within viable transport distance. Local councils desperate to avoid unrest offered temporary space. A chain of Sikh Gurdwaras opened volunteer distribution corridors. Welsh dairy cooperatives rerouted vehicles. A football stadium in Sunderland became an overnight food breakbulk point by sheer civic stubbornness. Within 16 hours, much of the withheld stock had been bypassed. Not all. Enough. Micro twist. Victor had tried to weaponize ownership. Alexander countered with cooperation. Late that night, standing on the operations floor beneath Canary Wharf's sleeping towers, Alexander watched new green lines bloom across the northern route map. Eleanor came to stand beside him. You know, she said, most billionaires, when attacked by the establishment, buy another newspaper. I considered it. You did not. I did. But lorry depots were faster. She laughed softly, then sobered. He won't stop. No. He might get uglier. Alexander's gaze remained on the map. Then he'll finally be honest. Outside, London glittered over the Thames as if nothing at all had changed. But under the city, in church halls and loading bays, in bus depots and council kitchens, in encrypted nodes and handwritten local ledgers, Britain was learning a dangerous lesson. It could keep moving without asking the old rooms for permission. Current part words, 1830. Total words, 7949. Part 5. By the sixth day, the country no longer looked shocked. It looked divided. There were now two Britons running side by side. One still waited for the old rails to return as they had been, cleaner perhaps, but recognizably hierarchical, with the right institutions at the top and the right people speaking first on television. The other Briton had discovered something addictive: responsiveness. A school kitchen in Leeds didn't care whether a local authorization came wrapped in central prestige, so long as children ate on time. A hospital procurement chief in Swansea didn't care which century a supplier's grandfather had attended Eton Inn if the insulin arrived before lunch. Borough councils, volunteer groups, warehouse managers, pharmacists, transport supervisors, and small business owners were becoming attached to a form of power that answered practical questions before protocol questions. This was not revolution. That made it more dangerous. It was habit change. Victor understood that at last, and it made him reckless. At 8:10 a.m., a leak hit every major newsroom in Britain. Purported internal documents from Blackwood systems, selective excerpts, carefully cropped emails, investment memos stripped of context, contingency models rendered to sound like intent. One phrase was repeated across screens within the hour: engineered dependency event. The implication was obvious. Alexander had not merely prepared for collapse. He had courted it. Eleanor stormed across the operations floor toward him holding a printed page because she was angry enough to want something she could crease. He forged connective tissue between real files, she said. Enough genuine fragments to make the fiction sticky. Alexander took the page, read 3 lines, and placed it down. He didn't do this himself. Does it matter? Yes. Why? Because whoever built this understands my archive structure. That narrows the betrayal. The room seemed to lean slightly inward. Betrayal in a crisis always sharpened every sound. Imogen began running document lineage checks. Eleanor started listing former senior staff. Alexander remained motionless for so long that people who knew him feared the stillness more than the anger that might follow. At last he said, "Lock the internal review to 5 names." Eleanor blinked. "You already know?" "Not know. Recognize." There had been a man 5 years earlier. Adrian Sloane. Brilliant, insecure, eager to be admired by wealth he privately resented. Alexander had hired him young, overpaid him early, and dismissed him only when it became undeniable that Sloane thought systems were less interesting than proximity to men celebrated for controlling them. Adrian had once said, only half joking, that the worst thing about working for Alexander was that he didn't know how to worship money properly. At the time, Alexander had filed that under decorative stupidity. Now it looked more consequential. Micro twist. Victor had found not a hacker or an enemy, but a discarded believer. By noon, every camera in Britain wanted Alexander's face. The Prime Minister's office requested comment. Parliament demanded inquiry language. The Bank of England issued a deeply careful statement about the importance of confidence in all emergency continuity mechanisms. Confidence, Alexander thought, was what institutions asked for after they'd spent decades renting it from the public's lack of alternatives. Eleanor watched him read the statement. You cannot ignore this one. I know. You also cannot answer it like a machine. He glanced at her. You have notes. I always have notes. She handed him a sheet. He scanned it and snorted once. That line is manipulative. It's honest. That's why it's manipulative. The emergency hearing was set for 4 o'clock in a committee chamber packed beyond reason. MPs, peers, journalists, advisors, cameras, legal teams, and enough ambition to poison a reservoir. Victor arrived early in Navy, composed again, his expression tuned perfectly to concern. Varon looked irritated before proceedings began, which Alexander took as a promising sign. When called, he sat under the lights and gave his name for the record. Questions came fast. Did you anticipate systemic failure? Yes. Did you warn government? In scenarios, repeatedly. Did you build infrastructure that could benefit commercially from public disruption? I built infrastructure that could prevent civic failure when public systems did what they have done. Did you describe collapse as a strategic opening in internal communications? In investment terms, yes. In human terms, no. That answer caused exactly the reaction Eleanor had predicted. Sharp intakes, scribbling pens, cameras leaning closer. Victor watched with the contained satisfaction of a man seeing his enemy choose honesty over safety. Then came the key question from an opposition MP with prosecutorial instincts. Mr. Blackwood, did you or did you not create conditions in which Britain would become dependent on a private architecture you controlled? Alexander could feel the room wanting blood or sainthood. Britain disliked complexity unless it came with subtitles. He thought of Mrs. Ramon's hands, of school kitchens, of the boy in the blazer asking if he was famous, of his mother scrubbing office floors beneath desks owned by men who would call themselves wealth creators on television. Then he answered, I created conditions, he said, in which Britain would not have to wait politely for people in expensive rooms to rediscover that ordinary lives are time-sensitive. Silence. He continued before anyone could break it. Yes, I built fallback rails. Yes, I expected failure eventually because any adult looking honestly at our dependency stack should have. Yes, some of my companies benefited from being early because foresight has value. But if you want me to apologize for preparing food routes, medicine bans, and local trade continuity in a country that outsourced resilience to quarterly reports, you'll need to find someone whose childhood taught them to confuse neglect with normality. No raised voice, no performance, just force. Then, from the far side of the room, a new voice cut in. May I clarify something? Heads turned. Adrian Sloane had entered. Even Victor looked surprised. Sloane was thinner than Alexander remembered, expensive in a strained way, wearing a suit just slightly too eager to prove access. He moved to the witness table with the brittle energy of a man who had rehearsed himself into courage. I was a senior analyst at Blackwood Systems, he said. The leaked documents passed through me years ago. The committee chair frowned. You submitted evidence? I'm submitting context. Victor's stillness sharpened. This was not the sequence he had paid for. Adrian looked at Alexander, then away. What's being implied is that Alexander Blackwood built contingency infrastructure to stage manage a national dependency event. That's not accurate. The room shifted. Victor's knuckles whitened once on the table edge. Adrian swallowed. He built it because he was paranoid. About institutional failure. About supply fragility. About poor districts being left behind. We all thought he was excessive. Obsessive, even. But every time we ran a scenario, he asked the same question. Who gets hurt first if the elegant version stops working? The committee chair leaned forward. Then why leak the documents? Adrian's mouth tightened with shame so visible it made several reporters look up from their notes. Because I wanted him cut down, he said. And because people like Mr. Harrington made that sound like justice. The chamber detonated without moving. Not noise. Meaning. Victor went white. Micro twist. The witness he thought would bury Alexander had come to bury himself and dragged Victor into the grave beside him. What exactly do you mean? Asked Barron quietly from the government bench. Adrian looked at Victor now. Really looked. I mean, Lord Harrington's office approached me through intermediaries. They wanted selective material. They wanted the narrative to say Blackwood had built a coup through logistics. I told myself it was truth adjacent. It wasn't. It was resentment with formatting. The committee room erupted. The chair called for order. Barron said something sharp to an aide. Reed covered his eyes for a second, as if revising several assumptions about the week. Victor rose halfway. Every line of him outraged nobility. This is absurd, he said. The word of a disgruntled ex-employee against mine? Adrian laughed once, hollowly. No, Lord Harrington. Against your messages. He placed a drive on the table. Eleanor, sitting behind Alexander, closed her eyes for one private second of vicious gratitude. The hearing adjourned in chaos. Outside, cameras swarmed like weather. Inside a private side room, Barron, Reed, and two legal officers moved with predatory calm. Victor tried to reclaim ground through bluster, influence, threat. For the first time in his adult life, the room did not bend around those tools. Alexander stood near the window, watching rain stripe down Whitehall's old stone, and felt not triumph but a colder, sadder thing. Waste. So much of Britain's suffering came not from necessity, but from the defensive vanity of men who would rather burn leverage than lose rank. Eleanor stepped beside him. You all right? Yes. You don't sound it. He watched police barriers glisten below. I wanted him better than this. She turned, surprised. Victor? Yes. Why? Alexander thought about it. Because it would have been useful if the people raised to inherit Britain had learned how to help carry it. That, more than the scandal, left Eleanor silent. The consequences came quickly. Formal investigation for Victor. Asset scrutiny. Communications seizure. Public disgrace. Fenwick Storage Group and two others raced to distance themselves. Several editors who had obediently run the leaked story suddenly rediscovered skepticism and printed the word alleged in font large enough to save careers. And in boroughs, depots, schools, clinics, and shops across the country, the effect was simpler. People stopped waiting for permission to trust what already worked